Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar. We took a break for the month of September in the best northern tradition. August, sorry, yes.
September now.
You can tell I'm not quite back from vacation yet. But we had a month off in the best northern tradition. And so now we're back with our September webinar. We've got a great one lined up for you today. But before I hand over to my colleague, Hannah Norberg, colleague and co-founder, who's here as always, let me say a couple of words about what we're trying to do at the Trade Policy Research Forum, if this is the first time that you're joining us. You'll see that our logo looks both like a graph and also like a bit of a bridge, specifically the Sydney Harbour Bridge. What we are trying to do is to build bridges between different parts of the trade policy community, between people doing research and practitioners on one part of it, between people doing research in economics and people doing research in law, political science, public policy, and all of these other areas that are relevant to trade policy. And of course, on top of that, we're trying to build a bridge between the global trade policy centers, places like Brussels and Washington, DC, and particularly people in low and middle income countries to try and get them access to the very best research at a faster rate than what was happening previously. We'd like to think that we've enjoyed a bit of success in doing that. We're coming on, we started during the pandemic, so we've been going since 2020. So that's a lot of monthly webinars by now. We reach out to a good number of people every month. We have a LinkedIn group, so if you'd like to follow us there, we invite you to do so. It's a good place to share your research, get comments, let people know about upcoming events. We have a mailing list, so after this webinar, the screen that will come up will be a sign-up link for the mailing list. Please do sign up for that so that we can keep in touch with you about future webinars. And of course, please look out for us with our LinkedIn posts, Twitter, X posts, and all that sort of thing. Hannah, let me hand over to you.
All right, thank you so very much, Ben. I see so many of our friends and colleagues and also some new people in the audience. That is always so exciting. First of all, before we get started, did you join the LinkedIn group? Because it, like Ben said, it's a really cool place to hang out. And we passed 4,000 people now recently. So there's a lot of people there, which we're just really happy about, because that means that a lot of people are enjoying this as much as we are, Ben. So it's not just for our entertainment anymore. So that's really cool to have you here. Also, get started in the chat box. How about you write, "Hi, I am Hannah. I'm coming in from Lund, Sweden." Well, you don't have to write Hannah, but write your name and write where you're coming from. Because then we know that you know where the chat box is. And then we can start the conversations there and get to know each other. Because one thing that is always true is that we run out of time. So make sure that you continue with these conversations. See, Aurora, she got it. Thank you.
Hi, Sano King. Hi, how are you?
Excellent. So I'm just gonna also, before we start, I'm also gonna say to everybody that this is a volunteer thing, the TPR forum that Ben and I are running here, but we're also getting a lot of help. So this particular webinar was put together by Jeffrey Chapman, who helps out with content, and so he's the brain behind this, and also who brought in our amazing speakers for us. Ricardo does our website, and Rabiul does our all our flyers. So in case there's anything else that you'd like to help us out with, or that you think that we can do better and you could help, please let us know. So without further ado, I am going to introduce very, very shortly, because you can find these people on LinkedIn and you don't need to hear me anymore on that. But Benedikt, who is the senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide, and he's presenting this really interesting paper that is based on the Cold War, which is sort of like a movie I'm really looking forward to. And Costanza Bosone, University of, I think you pronounce it Pavia, do you?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, then I knew.
Yeah, that's for.
Then I knew that, obviously, because I was in Italy on vacation last week, so I picked up the language.
Of course. Of course.
So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Benedikt, who will start the presentation. He will give him about 20 minutes, and then we'll hand it over to Costanza, and then we'll open up to the Q&A, and then you need to be ready because time flies.
So let me share this here. Okay, so hello from my side here officially. Thanks a lot to Ben and Hannah and Geoffrey for having me and for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be part of this this really great initiative. And as Hannah says, it's all voluntary. So my big applause and chapeau to you of organizing this beautiful thing. This is a joint paper I'm going to present here with Rodolfo Campos from the Bank of Spain and Jacopo Timini. I've seen Jacopo is also online, also from the Bank of Spain. So it is pertinent to stress that the views we express in this paper are those of us privately, and they don't necessarily coincide with those of the Banco de España or of the Euro system. I am, as Hannah said, a senior lecturer at the University of Adelaide, but I'm currently on leave without pay in Adelaide because I'm on a fully funded research stay at the Universidad Jaume I in Spain, in Castellón de la Plana, and my research and the whole stay and salary is funded by the European Union Next Generation EU Fund, so I'm gratefully acknowledge the financial support from the EU here. The paper is about the Cold War. So without much further ado, let's start. I think the audience here, I don't have to tell you much about trade integration being one of the pillars of the international or multinational world trading system. And suffice to say here that the feeling one gets as someone who is dabbling in the field of trade for the last years is that it seems that this cornerstone of this multinational multilateral trading system is on the way out, that trade integration is no longer the guiding principle. And what is more and more coming into focus are these considerations which fall under this term geopolitics, or geoeconomics. It's very funny as someone, I've started my PhD in 2009 in international trade, and the word geopolitics was not part of the vocabulary. And during the last few years, this term has basically supplanted the word trade. Basically everything that is trade is now seen through the lens of geopolitics. And obviously, these rising tensions we observe in the world, they align along certain political cleavages or political systems. We have the conflict US versus China, and this is nothing which has gone away with the end of the Trump presidency. To the contrary, the Biden administration has also increased tariffs even more considerably. So this is still there, and obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine is also an issue which has heightened these tensions. And the obvious question everyone is asking then is, what are the economic consequences of this fragmentation along geopolitical lines? And the thing is, there's lots of very good research on this question, also by co-authors, my co-authors here in the paper. There's lots of work on looking at scenarios, what happens when we fragment again into a bipolar world, what would happen if. So this is basically prospecting these scenarios into the future. But interestingly, there's not so much work, or much less work, on looking in the rearview mirror and looking at the what we've learned from history about previous periods or episodes of geopolitical fragmentation. And obviously the period of geopolitical fragmentation in the 20th century is the Cold War, this split of the world into the two blocs, the capitalist West and the socialist communist East. And interestingly, when you look into the academic literature, there is not so much on the trade effects in particular of this of the Cold War and so on. So we thought, well, this is something we should look into. So what do we do in this paper? We quantify the trade effects of the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain being this both physical barrier that divided Europe into two distinct blocks, but also the symbolic barrier. I mean, it's one of these key memes today, we would say, key images of the Cold War confrontation is exemplified by the Iron Curtain. So what we wanted to know, what are the trade effects of this physical barrier and of this regulatory or symbolic barrier on trade? And so how do we do this? Well, one of the key contributions we make in this paper is one reason why there's perhaps not so much quantitative work on this question is because there is a lack of historical trade data, particularly for Eastern Bloc countries. And what I mean with this is there is not a lack of data as such, but there's a lack of digitized data so that we can easily analyze this. And so what we do in this with this project, we provide a new database on trade between Eastern Bloc countries, and then we incorporate this new data into other historical trade databases, and then we analyze these new data to look at the trade effects of the Iron Curtain. And then what do we find? To give a short preview, well, what we find is that, yeah, trade between the East and the West was severely restricted, but that's perhaps not so surprising to anyone. But what is perhaps more surprising is, contrary to this popular image of the Iron Curtain, this division of these two blocks, actually, this curtain was not perhaps really made of iron. It was more permissive, and its thickness or its restrictiveness varied across time. And that's what we document in this paper. So we estimate these effects, and then what we then also do is we then feed our estimates into a counterfactual simulation exercise. So we ask ourselves the question, how would the world have looked like if there hadn't been this Iron Curtain dividing the world? And obviously, I want to stress here, this is not a counterfactual simulation in the complete sense of how would the world have looked like without the existence of this border in terms of culture, in terms of the life of people. No, what we mean more technically, how would trade have looked like in this counterfactual world without the Iron Curtain? There is a literature which deals with related issues on borders, on geopolitics and trade, as I already hinted at. And there is some papers on the Iron Curtain, so we're not the very first paper to study that. But what is new is arguably this focus on the time-varying effects of the Iron Curtain, and also the quantification of the trade effects using a counterfactual simulation exercise. I'm gonna stop here with the literature in interest of time. So to be concrete, here's a map. This is from Wikipedia, which just shows how Europe was divided during the second, for a big part of the second half of the 20th century. And we see the Western countries, capitalist, democratic countries on the west in blue, and on the east, the countries which are associated with the Soviet Union, the socialist or communist countries, and the black line is the Iron Curtain. So the famous part as a German was obviously the wall and the Berlin Wall, because Berlin was also divided into two parts, the western part and the eastern part. But the Iron Curtain was a physical barrier which stretched along the whole area of Europe. And the simple question is, how has this affected trade? And given that this is a seminar which tries to bring trade research to people, most of you have for sure seen some form of gravity modeling. That is a model which empirically relates the trade flows between countries I and J in a given year to variables to observable variables of interest. And the specification we use in our estimation exercise is very much standard or off the shelf, in the sense that we control for the import a year and the export a year fixed effects, as we would expect from Anderson van Winkop's insight into the gravity estimation literature. We have some standard gravity control variables, which are also used in the literature in abundance. And then we have a border effect, so we allow trade to be different when a trade flow crosses an international border, so to reflect the fact that there's much more domestic trade going on than international trade. But the regress of interest we have is the coefficient, or the coefficients in front of this dummy ICIJ. ICIJ is a dummy that is 1 if this trade flow in our data set is involving a flow from the east to the west, or from the west to the east. So it's a trade flow that crosses the Iron Curtain, and when it's within a block, then this dummy is 0. And the interesting thing is we allow this effect of the Iron Curtain to vary over time, so therefore it's this theta t. So we will trace out the evolution of the trade reducing effect of the Iron Curtain in our panel data set. The only thing what we will then do is, I'm not going to show you the parameter estimates, these thetas. Why not? Because they become a bit difficult to interpret. You will see this when I will go into the results in detail. So what we do is we do something very standard. We calculate a tariff equivalent of the trade reducing effect of the Iron Curtain. It's very easy to do. You take the estimated parameter, and then you go to the literature and take an estimate of the trade elasticity. We take standard values. We also do some robustness checks on this, but this is not, you know, the results are not in terms of their qualitative feature, how the variation looks over time. They don't depend on this. This is just a scaling thing. But the beauty of this is then we can interpret the results, which I'm going to show to you always, as the tariff equivalent. So by how much would there be the Iron Curtain reduces trade by how much? Well, it reduces trade by the amount which would be identical to a tariff of this height. Yeah. So if the tariff equivalent is 10%, then the Iron Curtain has the same effect as if there were a tariff imposed on the trade flow by 10%. The interesting thing then is also is that a positive number is a tariff, so there's a tax on imports, so this reduces trade. If the number would be negative, then this would be a negative tariff, which would be called a subsidy. Yeah. So this is propping up trade flows. So let's you'll see this in a second in the results. In terms of the data, as I said, our contribution is this augmenting the data which exists by digitizing data from East German trade statistics and by the Soviet Union. And the rest of the trade flows, they come from TradeHist, which is a really good database by Foucault and Hugo of 2016. So we use this and we add our data to this. Yeah, but without TradeHist, we wouldn't be able to do this. We construct also domestic trade data. I'm not going to go into detail there. If there's someone who's interested in this, we can talk about this later. The only thing what I want to show you in the short time I have here is showing you here. This is the data we digitize. So this here is an excerpt from the Eastern German statistical yearbook. You see this written in German. And this is the international trade data. So this is without innerdeutschen Handel, as it said here. And these PDFs are available on the internet. The only thing is that these data have not really been incorporated in a digital form into these into the trade for example, TradeHist or other historical trade databases. And obviously, what we then do is we apply the standard IMF procedure, which is used to harmonize the data as is done to all the other data in the TradeHist data set. So we describe this in detail in the paper. This is here the Soviet Union equivalent. So this is European trade. This is also digitized, and that's what we then have in the data. But let's go now to the in the last minutes I have to the results. And this here is the key result of the paper. This is the main result, and then we do different variants of that, but this is in a nutshell what the paper is about. So what I show you here is time in our data set from 1950 to 2000 here, and we plot this tariff equivalent of the Iron Curtain estimate. Yeah. So what this means here, 1950, the tariff equivalent of the Iron Curtain is 43–44%. So that means trade between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc was reduced by the amount in the similar way as a tariff of 44%. So this is a very high tariff equivalent estimate. So at the beginning of our sample here, not the beginning of the Cold War already starts earlier, but out of lacking data in the years before we start here, we see that at the beginning of this period here in the sample, the trade restricting effect is quite large, 45% tariff equivalent. And then we see a decline in the 50s, already mid-50s, to about 30. And this decline continues and settles in here in this somewhere in the mid-20s. So the tariff equivalent of the Iron Curtain is about 20% in the years leading up to the fall of the Iron Curtain of the Berlin Wall. And then we have, because of, well, the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have some issues with the data. So we have this gap here. But afterwards, when our sample is complete again, what we see is that then this effect of the Iron Curtain is still there. It's still significant. These shaded areas are the confidence intervals, but it declines rapidly towards basically zero at the end of our sample. What we then do is, we don't need this equation here. What we then do is we split up the trade effects into the different flows. We can allow in our regressions to distinguish between the trade reducing effects or the tariff equivalent of that affects trade flows from the Eastern communist countries to the Western countries. And in the other direction, we can separate this. And what you see actually is quite consistent, east to the west and west to the east. We see in both of these this decline over time. So we see this time variation. The Iron Curtain was not as, it was not a monolithic block. Yeah, there was evidently trade going on, and its effect declined over time. We also then allow for a time variation for the effect affecting trade flows within the bloc. So international trade between Eastern countries and between Western countries. And here you now see we have a tariff equivalent of -10%. So actually there is a subsidy. This is, so trade within the blocs is higher than expected, is as if it had been subsidized. So what this means is there was trade integration going on within the Eastern Bloc and within the Western Bloc. We know about the Western European integration. The European community is getting deeper and deeper. But we see this integration in the West is not as deep. Well, or it appears as if it's not as deep. Well, this is an artifact of the fact that Western Europe integrates with many other countries. So actually, in relative terms, the integration within the Western countries is not as large because Europe integrates into the World Trade Organization. But in the East, we see, because these countries are very isolated as such, we see this larger subsidy here. We see this bigger perceived integration within the bloc, but this is because they were isolated basically within everyone else. And I'm running out of time. So what we then also look at is trade with neutral countries, Austria and Finland. And we see neutrality in terms of trade was essentially cheap talk, you could say. The trade with the West was hardly affected, but trade with the East of Austria and Finland faced very similar trade impediments, tariff equivalents, as in the full specification. With Western-leaning countries, that is Switzerland, Ireland, and Sweden, we see basically the same, hardly any restriction or observed trade restrictions with the Western countries, but are large tariff equivalent with the East. And Yugoslavia, this country under Tito, which tried to kind of go a third way. At the beginning, they went with the Soviet Union, and there was a big fallout with Stalin. When you look into the history of that, at the beginning of our sample, Tito already has fallen out with Stalin, so already there's this distancing with the East, and we see also big trade impediments of Yugoslavia with the East, but also with the West. In our counterfactual simulation, with this I'm going to stop. I'm over time. We ask this question using these estimates: how would trade have looked like if the Iron Curtain hadn't existed? And I plot here the trade volume in the data we observe, so with the Iron Curtain, and in red dashed the trade volume, the model, the quantitative trade model implies we would have observed. And here I show you the percentage differences. And what you see at the beginning of the sample, trade would have been nearly 500% larger, and even till the end of the Cold War, trade would have been twice as large. And what does that mean in terms of real wages? Well, the West every year lost about 0.5% of real wages because of the Iron Curtain. And in the East, because these economies are smaller, the real wage effect was actually even smaller. Real wages were 1%. Would have been 1% larger if there hadn't been the Iron Curtain. So we quantify the effect of the Iron Curtain to wrap up. We find that it was significant, sizable, that's not surprising, but also we saw there is quite some variation over time. So this story is a bit more shades of gray, degrees of gray, than just black and white. And in summary, the Iron Curtain posed a formidable barrier to trade between Eastern and Western countries. So it illustrates quite perfectly, going back to how we started, the perils of geopolitical fragmentation. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Here's the link to the data. For those of you who want to use the data, you can go to the website of Rodolfo, and there it's online already. You can use the data. Please cite us. Thanks.
All right, excellent. This is so exciting, especially with the U.S. Saying Trump saying 25% tariffs on everything from China. That sort of gives a very good start to think about. But I'm gonna not talk about that. I'm gonna leave it to Costanza. Thank you, Benedikt. Really great presentation, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm starting sharing my screen. Okay, I think you are now seeing my screen. You should be able to see it. Perfect. Okay, so thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Benedikt, for your presentation. I went through your paper, and I just want to tell everybody that the presentation was really quick but complete. Like, you really managed to convey the message, which is not always easy. I mean, after writing all the paper and then managing to wrap up everything in just a nutshell, it's not that easy. So really, that was great. And yeah, me as a discussant, I will go a bit through. So this is, first of all, the this is the paper. So the title, and he gave you the link, but of course you can also find here. I think the slides are available for everybody. And so the first question that comes to my mind, if I can, get it right. So the first paper that came to my mind after reading yours was the one by Gobinat Italia, because they basically, I was confident that you were familiar with that. And, they basically look at the way trade, investment, fragmentation are changing along geopolitical lines since Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they compare it to the early ages of the Cold War. And I mean, this is just a brief overview of findings. So they find that there's a significant decline in trade and FDI flows between geopolitically distant blocs during the Ukraine war. They find that fragmentation is currently small, but their guess is that it will actually worsen also along the lines of the Cold War and what has already happened. And then they say that there's a new role which is played by non-aligned connector countries. And so my question would be, I'm sorry for this, but like my PC is, what we were saying before. Okay. that the PC isn't working correctly. So my question would be, based on the findings in your paper, how do you foresee the current geopolitical situation worsening, particularly in the light of the historical trends from the Cold War? And the other interesting fact, from my point of view, would be the role played by those third countries which are emerging, so the so-called third bloc, and these non-aligned countries, how the role has evolved compared to what was happening during the Cold War. And then I have another question. I'm not sure if you want to start answering this, or we just go through the second question and then you can start replying to all of them.
Let's do that. I would say let's collect and I answer.
Perfect. Then the second question is from my paper, and which I co-authored with Stamato during our tenure at the European Central Bank. What we found, again, our views are only personal, so not from the European Central Bank, but like what we found was that geopolitical tensions have an heterogeneous effect between advanced economies and emerging economies. And the impact is stronger on advanced economies. And I would like to ask you, how does this sensitivity, would you say, have changed compared to the Cold War? If there were notable differences in how various countries or regions were responding to geopolitical tension at the time, and if you think that something similar is happening right now, or your intake on this, and then what implication might these historical partners have for understanding the current trends of geopolitical fragmentation? So these are the my questions from taking inspiration from your paper.
Okay, thanks so much, Costanza, for reading the paper and for making these very pertinent questions. So I'm gonna just answer these before we open up the floor, I imagine. Yes. Connect the countries, but you started with, I think, let's start with Gita Gopinath's and co-authors paper. Obviously, we are aware of this paper. This is really like what they call concurrent work. We were working on the paper, and we came out a day in between each other's paper in terms of working papers, and we didn't know each other about each other's group working on that. I mean, they have definitely a different focus on terms of directly comparing it with the Ukraine experience and so on. Whereas for us, obviously, this is the setting in which we do this, because it's this today's setting, but we don't plan to engage in some comparison with current day trade data. I think we come to very similar conclusions in terms of that the Cold War was had a substantial effect on trade restrictions and so on. So, and in the paper we cite them, so it's in the paper. I haven't talked about it about the paper today in the interest of time, because I didn't want to focus on the literature so much. They stress connector countries. Obviously, yes. This is a. I like the term connector country because it is neutral. It's in some sense clinical. Obviously, when we think about what that means in practice, there is also lots of rerouting of trade going on. We see increases in exports of certain countries, which are suspiciously close to, for example, Russia in the case of Ukraine. So obviously, other countries can play a role as bridges in if we have the idea of that this is a real trade cost and they can help. If we talk about, there is a sanctions regime in terms of that prohibits exports of certain goods to certain countries, then it seems that there is also lots of rerouting going on, and then whether this is welfare enhancing or not, let's say this is difficult to put it in a very neutral point here. Yeah. So obviously, this may also be in the historical data. I mean, there's a clear difference between the Cold War experience and today's experience when we think about trade connections between the blocs. I mean, if we now talk about blocs, so there is China on the one side, and there's Russia versus Western countries, and there's perhaps non-aligned or more neutral countries in the rest of the world. Obviously, China is much more integrated with the rest of the world. Russia was very much integrated with European countries, particularly in energy imports. So I think there's a key difference that the West, for example, depends much more on the East, but we also know that countries like China depend much more on the West. So I think there is a key difference is this interconnectedness, and this joint dependentness today is much higher than during the Cold War. So I haven't shown you these graphs, but when you look at the trade volume involved with this exercise in terms of world trade, it's very small in the historical exercise. But obviously, if we now were to erect an iron curtain between Western countries and Eastern countries, whatever that means, well, I mean, the trade affected would be orders of magnitude more, and so I would think that the welfare effects of doing something like this today would be much larger. You also asked, yeah.
Oh no, I was just like linking to what you were saying. I was thinking that we could say that during the Cold War there was a strict distinction between these two blocks. While if we think about right now, these connectors role is something rather new. That was my thought, and I was interested in knowing what you actually thought about this. But I think that's the point. Like it was very different. Like there were two strict blocks, and right now it's a bit more complex, maybe.
I mean, we are somewhere in the depending on who you ask or how you want to look at it, we are in a multipolar world. But at least I have the feeling that some politicians want us to move back towards a bipolar world where it's Western countries against well, non-Western countries. And when I say against, I mean we're talking about trade policy initiatives here. I think just like there is I think things have changed in the West, particularly when you look into the US. There was always a bipartisan consensus, strong on the Republican side, but still there was basically a bipartisan consensus for free trade and for trade integration, and trying to get, at least during the last years, get China into the fold. And now we have a bipartisan consensus of pushing China to the side and raising up trade barriers even with European partners. So there are these differences. And obviously the non-alignment countries in this talk, today they are larger. So there will be more trade diversion going on. So in some sense, this is good for business people in innocent bystander countries, at least countries which try to portray themselves as such. Obviously, there will also be pressure by both by the West, and we see this by the West and by China and Russia to pull countries to their sides. But in the meantime, businesses in these countries, they will probably gain from that. But obviously, that's more trade diversion. That's not really trade creation, right? So this is from a welfare perspective, this is not really what we have in mind as trade economists.
That's a very good point. While you were speaking, actually, I was also thinking that the world has changed also in terms of, you know, the internet and all of that. Like we are much more connected than what we used to be. So this might be another factor entering the picture when we talk about these connectors, and so might be another reason why things now are different.
I mean, what I found fascinating to learn from this project so far was, yes, today we have the internet, and I mean, the world is not flat. I'm a trade economist. Obviously, the world is not flat. There's lots of trade costs. But in terms of communication, there has been a huge reduction of communication costs. So there's much more of exchange, instantaneous exchange of messages, of news, and so on, at least when there's still free communication available for citizens. And that's not the case in all countries. But what we see even in this Cold War, which I mean, obviously, I think I speak for all of us. We know this essentially. I mean, I'm born in '83, so I'm, so to speak, I was still born in the Cold War, but my memory of what I remember is basically the end of this. Yeah. So for us, the Cold War is something which happened in the movies, and it is portrayed to us as this black and white world where there was no exchange going on, and it was very shut off. And this is not the case. I mean, when you look, I mean, it's fascinating when you start to read up, and I think that's also something interesting for policymakers today. Like, there is today a tendency of putting things into black and white categories or false dichotomisms, and life is very often gray. There's shades of gray. And when you look into the history, I mean, I found it fascinating to learn that there was a trade agreement between the US and the USSR in 1972. It never came into force because then there was an amendment to the Trade Act, which basically said, we're not going to apply the MFN status to the USSR. So de facto, the agreement was never applied, but there was an agreement and Nixon was trying to negotiate. And so what I want to say with this, there have always been these links, and today we also see this. Obviously, there is huge political differences between Russia, China, Western countries, and still we engage in trade on a much bigger scale. But even back then, the world was not as simple as an action movie where there's the good guys and there's the bad guys and it's black and white. I think there was stuff going on, and I think that was interesting to learn from that project.
Yeah.
Let me pick up if I can. I mean, there was a question that came up in the Q&A, and you know, firstly, excellent paper and great comment. So, you know, thank you very much. Something I'll just highlight for people, you said it as you were going through, but the data set is available. So if you found this interesting, you want to think about other applications, go and get the data, reproduce what they've done, learn exactly how they've done it. So that's really a great example of being transparent and putting everything out there so that people can learn from it. So really do appreciate that. But the question I had is this. When we think of the bundle of policies that go into creating the dummy that you guys are using, you know, what sort of policies are we talking about? And I think you brought out some of the complexity of that in your last response. But then, you know, part B, I actually really like that you report your estimated coefficients as ad valorem equivalents. I think that's something we don't do enough. It makes it much easier to interpret.
Yes,
It's a very easy thing to do, but it's not widely done. However, I'm going to ask you the question that everyone asks me when I do that, which is how confident can we be that the measures going into that dummy are actually iceberg type measures, that they affect variable costs? Because of course your results all the way through would be different if you assume that these were fixed costs, you know, in a kind of Chanet sense. You would get a whole bunch of different, I mean, that would play through differently even in the counterfactual. So maybe if you can just give us a little more color on the sort of policies that are going into that dummy, that might be really helpful.
That's a very good question. And I think it's spot on. And that's also where I would want to have more, you know, I would love to people throw references at me to be more detailed on that. I mean, we had in the development of the project, we had discussions about should we control for trade policies or which types of policies, and should there be tariffs, should there be trade agreements? And we discussed this quite heatedly, I admit. But in the end, I think the argument we all agreed on is, well, I mean, the trade policy is the endogenous thing. I mean, and that's something which today is perhaps evident for everyone. I mean, there won't be a trade agreement between the EU and China right now. There won't be, for political reasons. And so I think if we put agreements there, I mean, where have these agreements been? They have been within the West. So we're taking out part of this barrier. So that's one of the reasons we don't put this there. because we want this to be reflected, because that's exactly the endogenous reaction of policy to that. And then the other thing is, and that goes a bit more towards what the nitty-gritty details of where you're hinting at, and that's exactly the problem. I was trying to read up on trade policy, and that's again this comment about the movies. One has this naive perception of that this was a monolithic bloc, and it was anything but. There was trade policy initiatives at the country levels, and there were these trade agreements which never came into force. And obviously, you also have the fact that, for example, in the Soviet Union, but for sure also to a lesser extent in the West, you don't have to be explicit about things you can't do in a dictatorship. There was a state monopoly on foreign trade on the Soviet side. Yeah, so this was all notionally going through trade missionaries and the Ministry of Commerce in the Soviet Union. But obviously there's degrees of freedom, or you will have this in speech. We talk about self-censorship, anticipatory self-censorship. And I think here similar things happen in a sense. Firms may test the water, or they know, can I get away with that on the West, on the Eastern side? And so in the end, to cut this story short, there is the moment you start reading, it becomes very complex. And at the same time, you never know, okay, now I'm going to start codifying all these things. I really don't know whether this is actually what de facto was driving things. And so therefore we thought for all these reasons, we just want to have everything in this dummy. And the other thing is obviously the general globalization, trade cost reduction trend, containerization, whatnot, all these things, that goes into our time varying border effect, which I haven't shown to you, but it's in there. So this allows for this. But is it fixed costs, or is it ad valorem? Well, obviously, this is a very good question, and I give this question to all trade economists. This affects basically everything what we do here. We don't look into heterogeneity, right? If we wanted to do an analysis of which types of firms were affected, at least on the Western side, then fixed costs for this type of selection, obviously that would drive everything. We stay here in the aggregate level. So, but obviously this is much more difficult in reality.
And I think part of the beauty of your approach is that you're able to, the dummy, how we interpret it is a separate question from the result that you get from the dummy. You can be confident that you're capturing all of this stuff that was going on. And so, thank you for giving us that richness of everything going on there. I think that's really important. I'll tell you where my question kind of came from. I'm not going to give my year of birth since it's embarrassing, and I'm not going to get Hannah to do it either. But I was actually surprised by how low the tariff equivalents were. These are not small tariff equivalents in an objective sense. But when you think of kind of the Anderson van Wynkoop trade costs paper, representative trade costs for a high-income country, about 170%. And there's only a small part of that's policy. And so, I guess what you're saying is that, there would be a higher overall level of trade costs, but also it would be more skewed towards policy costs than we would see, in an Anderson van Wynkoop type estimate from 2004. But I was surprised not to see kind of triple-digit tariff equivalents.
Obviously you can scale these things with the sigma, with the elasticities you get, but that's also one of these questions, right? Which is perennial to this whole quantitative trade literature for the last 20 years. Aren't these numbers too small? Aren't these numbers too small? So let's put it like this. I wouldn't take away from this, and this is nothing particular to our study. This applies to this whole field of quantitative also CGE modeling or of the estimated type. This is the same for all of these studies. As a policymaker, you should never step away from this. Oh, look, this is 1-2%, or this is 5% GDP. So what is that? This is peanuts. This is really, we have to be very clear. These are very simple models. These are static models. There's no dynamics. There is nothing on innovation. Like trade restrictions obviously also affect the innovativeness of the sector and so on via their competitiveness effects and so on. So these are, and also the linkages between countries, even if we have intermediates with a roundabout production, but still there is nothing like a critical input in here, right? So there is nothing like this. So all of these things we can easily think about in a narrative sense, but which are difficult to put into a quantitative model. They would make us revise these numbers upwards in terms of like the things would be much more costly. And I think, and the other thing is what people also sometimes misunderstand. I think here author Doran Hansen and this literature on the labor market consequences of trade integration has shown us quite plastically that there is a negative effect which can even be positive, but there's structural change going on, and there will be areas which produce certain goods, and these areas are exposed to shutting down. You're no longer allowed to sell to the country, and then the jobs there get lost, and so this can be devastating for an area. And then you get all these things. I mean, just look at, I'm German, so look at the Eastern German experience after unification. There was economic unification. The exchange rate was fixed, 1 Eastern Mark to 1 Western Deutschmark. This propped up wages a lot, which was great for workers, but abolished the economy in Eastern Germany because these firms were not competitive. And so what happened? Jobs were lost. Young people moved out, particularly women in Eastern Germany, and you get aging populations. And nowadays you get support for right-wing parties and so on. So there's lots of things going on which can be devastating for a region, even though the effect is just 1 or 2% at the aggregate GDP level, because most cities or industries are small. But if you happen to be a worker in the industry which is affected, then this is devastating to you. So from what is the policy conclusion from all these types of studies should never be these are peanuts. And the other thing, and you know this, Ben, obviously, but for the audience to be very clear, these numbers, these are static numbers. So that means in this model, there is not really time. So this is for 1 year. In 1 year, you lose, let's say, 1%. But in the next year, again, you will have 1% less. So in every year, you will be 1% poorer than before. So it's not a one-off effect. This is an effect. Every single year you will be this amount poorer. So it's not that we can just sit this out. This is not about dynamics and transition. This is just long run comparative static, as the economists would say. So it's every year this effect occurs again and again and again, as long as the policy here, the Iron Curtain, is in place. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. The other, I mean, if I can just go back to a different set of results that you presented, I think it's also a really good example of where presenting partial equilibrium results gives a little bit of a different flavor from seeing the general equilibrium counterfactuals, because your trade results there are large. I mean, you're finding like differences of 500%. I remember that as one of the headline numbers. So I think that, again, if I were to pick this out, and if we tend to have a lot of PhD students in the audience, if this is something, if this is the sort of model that you're working on, you often want to look at those two effects. I mean, having a nice counterfactual is great both for interpretation of your paper. It helps people understand it. But sometimes it can also make clear that you're dealing with something that's really very big and important, even if that doesn't seem to come out of the coefficients as strongly as you might have expected. There's one really, a couple of detailed data questions that I'll just put to you. So I think these are possibly people who would like to go on and do some work in this area.
One is, where did you get the GDP data from? Is that in the PDFs that you were OCRing as well? And then the second one is, what level of granularity do you have? I assume it's aggregate trade flows between
Yes, it's
countries,
aggregate
and
trade
you
flows.
can't look at products and all that kind of stuff.
No. This is aggregate trade flows, and the GDPs, as far as I remember, are from Trade Hist. I would have to look it up again in the paper, but I think they're from Trade Hist, the GDP data. And we use this shortcut of using GDP minus exports, which to construct domestic trade, which is obviously wrong in the sense of a strict theoretical model, as long as there is intermediates and stuff like that. But and this is not because I say it, that's my co-authors, Jacopo and Rodolfo, they've published a paper where they look into this question, and they use this proxy of using GDP minus exports for domestic trade, and they compare it in data sets where we actually observe domestic trade, and the estimated gravity coefficients are the same. So this does not really matter. And why doesn't it matter? Well, because we have time varying importer and exporter fixed effects. So if a country has a different degree of intermediate use, or like, you know, how much of GDP is actually value added, this all gets captured by the fixed effect. So for the estimation stage of the trade cost reducing effect or trade cost increasing effect of the Iron Curtain, or any other policy for that matter, this is really not the issue. So this proxy is actually it's, you know, if you're teaching a theoretical trade class, then you would stress this is problematic. But in practice, when you look into the data, in the specifications we use in international trade, these biases do not really affect what we do. So we are quite confident on that.
Yep, that's a very useful result in and of itself, because it's the data tend to be so much more accessible. Let me hand over to Hannah. Do you want to come in with a question?
Yes, I am loving this conversation because it goes so very well with your mini course, Ben, like how you do gravity modeling, and then how all these discussions are about how to interpret your results. I am loving it, and I'm hoping that people see that link and can use it. I would like to ask two things that I always use. Benedikt, but also Costanza, from all of these things that you've seen, when you deep dive into this, what is it that you have discovered? And no, what is it that you have discovered that you don't know, is my question. So, you know, when you start digging into something, you're like, wait, there's this, now that I know this, what I actually don't know is this. This is what I really, you know, need to know in order to like base my conversation about, or I'm now realizing, because this is such an open field, right? But seeing that you already have constructed this data and it's available, what is it for the young researchers who are out here? What is it that you wish that somebody ran with, and that would be a good complement to this study? And then also, I'm going to throw in here specifically, what is the main takeaway for policymakers now that we're heading into this season, this silly season that is election season that has been going this year, and all these tariffs, and as Ben and Benedikt both pointed out, that they're not very high. You know, 25% is being thrown around. What is it that they need to know? And also, Jeffrey, who put this webinar together, was asking specifically, what is the takeaway for policymakers in Africa that, you know, could be caught between? So I'm just throwing three things in there. You gave me the mic for a second, and I grabbed it and I threw some stuff out there.
Costanza, do you want to also went to you? Or?
Yeah, as you wish. I can. Shall I start?
Yeah,
I can.
Yeah, please,
okay.
Please,
yeah.
Please
So you take a break. Yeah. Sure. So what I found out reading Benedikt papers, but also while I was reading mine, is that the word is great, what he was saying before. So that's the main takeaway, I would say. And we have this idea that things are rigid, and that's true. While I was reading his paper, your paper, Benedikt, the fact is that you really think about this Cold War world, and you imagine that there were these two blocks and things were like written in the stone basically, and these two blocks were rigid and they weren't communicating with each other at all. They weren't trading with each other. There were no connections at all, and instead the world is gray actually, and there are a lot of things going on, and that's something which was happening back then, and it's something that is happening also right now. And that's one thing, which is also somehow connected to the second thing that you asked about, which is what policymakers should account for. In this case, they should account for the fact that geopolitical tensions matter. They always have. Maybe from my point of view, there was a period like I was born in 1998, and like from my point of view, I was used to thinking that the world is, globalized and we are all trading with each other. Nothing is going to happen. Things will always be like this. I was taking it for granted that right now things are changing. And the point is that things are changing because geopolitical tensions matter. Because just because something has always been like this or has been like this for 10 years, it doesn't mean that it will be like this forever. And I don't like whether the change is for the worse or for the better, as always is not easy to say. As a general rule, like divisions don't create welfare on average, but I mean, we should for sure, and that's also connected to Africa finally, also with the UN Assembly, which is taking place in these days. They were also talking about the role that Africa will be playing in the future and should be playing right now. And all of this to say that on one hand, geopolitical tensions matter, and the fact that they matter shouldn't be just accounted for in a way like saying, okay, fine, they matter, and we need to create new restrictions, or somehow we need to become more aware of like the people, like the countries we're trading with. But they should matter in the sense that a world where everybody is more or less playing in a fair way, and should be eventually the goal. And Africa as well, and all these third connectors, all these countries which are now emerging, because we're living in a world which has never been disconnected, and these countries should be accounted for. They should matter like all of the other blocks, because blocks no longer exist. We are just all interconnected with each other. And I also think that the paradigm that we used to think in terms of, Western and Eastern bloc, it will be useful up to a certain point, but right now things are changing, and things have already changed actually. So that would be my reply to this. So I'll leave the floor to Benedikt.
Thank you, Costanza. I mean, many of my answers overlap quite considerably with what you just said. So what did I take away, what I didn't know before, and what would I want other people to look into in terms of research? I mean, as I think has come through, I was trying to read up on the Cold War, and it turned out to be so much more complex than what the movies made me believe, perhaps. And it is very, very, very complicated. And there is, I mean, the world is not a movie or a novel where you can have these stark divisions and these things. I think that's something perhaps you intuitively know, but I mean, this project has brought this to the forth quite considerably, and that it's so much more complex to understand the trade relationships among countries. And so I would really, if in the audience people have references and stuff where they say, yeah, I've read this and this helped me a lot to understand this era, please let me know. I also realized how much is lost to time. I mean, it is so difficult to get back into the mindset. So you read papers from the 1970s, 80s about this, and you sense that you're swimming somewhere in the void, because obviously things were very different. Values have been different. So it's difficult to orient yourself in this literature, and it's difficult to actually get a grasp on, well, how was trade policy actually back then? Who should I read? And obviously there's lots of books on WTO, the history of the WTO and Western integration, but what has happened on the other side, and how was our relation with this side, and how complex was it? It's actually not that easy to find that out, and I think I also need to read more on that. So that's something I learned, and I don't know whether this is a good idea for a PhD student. I'm not making a comment on that. I just say I would want to read more on this. I found it surprising how little there is in terms in economics, at least what I found, on analyzing these big picture questions of trade between the East and West and how it was just like 50 years ago. I mean, come on, there must be more stuff, and perhaps back then there were no data, or there were not so good computational things. I think there is a scope for call it economic history type papers, economic history / trade papers, which look into more detail into exactly these things. What is the effect of these different policy initiatives which we observed? I would love to read these papers, and I would love to cite them, but I just didn't find them. So yeah, so that's what I would love to read. I don't know whether this is a good idea. I mean, for Africa, yeah, I mean, and sorry, there was also a comment. I've scrolled and I see someone said this is more like diversion of East-West and West-East trade to the domestic economies in the East and West. Exactly. There is trade diversion from the international to the domestic. This is exactly what's going on there. And therefore it's so important to have the domestic trade data in the analysis, in the gravity regression, to have these trade diversion towards the domestic market. So this is exactly Aniru, I think that's the name I see here.
Aniru, yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly what's going on there. Yeah, this is exactly what's going on. In terms of Africa, yeah, I mean, in some sense there is scope, right? Because there's trade diversion going on. Something could fall off the table for Africa. That could be that's the good way of reading this. I think it's a bit more complicated because I'm more afraid of, particularly if you're a small country, in economic terms, you will get under pressure to pick a side, and is this in your national interest, or how do you walk this line? Singapore is quite successful in trying to be friends with everyone. I think Singapore is singular in this aspect. Other countries might be, I mean, there may be carrots dangled in front of you, which may be attractive in the short run. Perhaps you will wake up and this will be not good. So I think for Africa, I think it will be difficult for particularly economies that are not that strong. And yeah, policymakers, what should they take away? I think what policymakers should take away, there's nothing in this paper in terms of is there a specific policy conclusion, or should it take away a number? I think what policymakers should take away is that Costanza summarized it very well. We have either been born or grown up, or have grown accustomed, as people who are a bit older, to a world where everything works wonderful. We go on the plane and we leave the plane in Brisbane, and we can go everywhere, at least in Western countries, with our passports, and there is trade. You can buy stuff from everywhere across the globe, and it's an integrated world. And there is sometimes the perception of policymakers that globalization is this force of nature, particularly in the 90s. Politicians talked about it as we can't change it. It's coming towards us and we have to deal with it. Actually, politicians are much more powerful than they think they are. That this is a constructed world, because this is a political world. We have created a world, a multilateral trading system, where we all agreed on driving down our tariffs and our barriers to the benefit of all of us. And this idea, which was very, very intuitive, or it costs us in our trade courses to teach people, comparative advantage, and that it's good for everyone. And I think this lesson has been lost a bit, and politicians do not understand that things are the way they are because of what people have done. But if we make the wrong decisions, or if we again erect barriers and impose tariffs, and Hannah has said it, the numbers we discuss, or which we already actually impose, are in a ballpark like this, or higher, or even worse, we make blanket prohibitions. I think to be very topical, the latest news I've heard that in the US, there's a discussion of not letting Chinese cars into the country because of security concerns. No matter what our political opinions are on different things, but if we start to accept these types of arguments, then we also can't buy food from somewhere else. We can't buy anything because we can poison food, we can create contraptions. I mean, this is a free-for-all for putting ourselves into our little house. But the problem then is we're gonna be poorer, and the problem is it's gonna be particularly working class people who gonna sense this, because things are gonna get more expensive. And I think that's what's always behind this. So politicians, be wary what you wish for. And if you talk about trade restrictions and imposing them, then the world will change. The world is man-made in this regard, because it's trade policy, and things can change quickly. And then you wake up in a world where you're really worse off. And yeah, then it's difficult to go back. So
I think that's a great note to end on, a note of caution. Let me add a couple of things. I really liked your suggestion for the kind of space that's open for, you know, what I would think of as kind of quantitative economic history in this area. I think we don't do enough of that in trade at all. I agree with you totally. So there's got to be, you know, very high return to someone going out and, as you guys have done, doing the hard work to assemble the data and then finding an interesting question. The second thing I'll add, you know, we got to policy a little bit at the end of this. If people are interested in a different take on geopolitical tensions, so less historical and more current, I think it's last year's World Trade Report has a whole section on geopolitical tensions. And they model it out in different ways, put countries in groups. You can discuss that till the end of time. But it does give you this sense of how things could change if we decide that that's what we're going to do, if politicians decide that. So let me say thank you to Benedikt for a great presentation. It's a really excellent, very informative, and again, very transparent paper. So I really appreciate all of that. I learned a ton from it, so I'm very grateful. And Costanza, thank you also for really excellent discussion comments. They were right on point. And, you know, you have a lot of expertise in the area, and I think we had a really nice discussion between the two of you.
Thank you.
A little bit of advertising. We'll be coming back for a webinar in October. Keep an eye on our mailing list to see the date. And we'll be talking about trade policy careers, which is something that we do once a year, talking about sort of how to get started, and probably looking specifically at the case of consulting and independent work this time. So if that's of interest to you, please do join us in October.
Sure.
Again, thank you to our guests, and thank you to my partner in crime, Hannah, and wishing everyone a good rest of their day.
Thank you, you too. Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for having me.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Wonderful. Thanks.